السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم ما بعد. And welcome to another video on the Islamic Knowledge YouTube channel. And before we go any further, if I can encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel and consider sharing this video with others so that inshallah others can benefit as well. Now in today's video we're looking at a super beneficial book written by the late Pakistani scholar Zafar Ishaq Ansari, who passed away I believe in 2016. The book is titled The Early Development of Islamic Fiqh in Kufa, with special reference to the works of Abu Yusuf and Shaybani, and it was written by the author in 1966, so quite a while back, as his PhD thesis at McGill University. Now this copy that I've printed obviously looks very weird. You can see it's got part 5 at the start. That's because I've printed 5 parts that are actually found in separate PDFs online. I've put them together as one PDF and I've printed it with Doxu. You can actually access all 5 parts as a PDF on the Islamic Knowledge Telegram channel, which I will upload them there, where I've combined them all into one part, and you can access them by just going on Telegram, typing in @IK courses and just joining that channel that you see. But you see, you can get a complete version of this book, like in complete order, without having to combine any PDFs. But it's just a very old copy, and it's hard to get hold of in hard copy, and the soft copy, the online version of the original PhD thesis, is a bit hard to read. And this 5-part version is quite easier on the eyes, and it's a bit more of an enjoyable read. Also, in this one, what you get is that you get the footnotes right at the bottom of every page, whereas in the original PhD thesis, what you notice is that the footnotes are actually end notes, so you have to keep going back to the end, and sometimes it has some really long footnotes every now and then, and you'd have to go right to the back of the book to see them. Anyway, I'll share the PDF of this version on the @IK Courses Telegram channel, but I do also have notes, my own personal notes on all 5 parts of this thesis, which I'll also be uploading to the @IK Courses Telegram channel. Now honestly, I genuinely believe every Hanafi should read this book. It's a beautiful mix of the history of fiqh while also dealing with some Orientalist ideas that are in vogue. For example, he deals with the concept of sunnah in the early Muslim community, the usage of asanid, the idea of the ancient schools, the e silencio argument, and other theories of the Orientalists. But at the same time, he gives us the alternative picture. So in some ways, it's a bit different from Shaykh Mustafa Al-A'zami's book, in the sense that he doesn't just respond to Orientalists, he gives us the picture that we feel is more accurate. The first part is an introduction. So my first part is actually starting somewhere inside my current version. So if we go to part 1, it begins here. Part 1, this is the introduction. The early centuries of Islam have formed the subject of several important studies. By the way, that language is super easy. So if anyone just wants to kind of understand an Islamic perspective whilst reading an academic book, this would be the book to kind of start off with as well if you want. It kind of gives a basic overview in the introduction of the arguments related to Islamic law in the Western world, as well as discussions in the Arab world on Islamic jurisprudence, and discussions in the Arab world on what is the role of hadith. So he speaks about Shaykh, Golzaya on page 151. So if we go to page 151, he mentions a few interesting points about Golzaya and Shaykh and what exactly it is that they did. He says, but Shaykh had carried Golzaya's skepticism to the point of declining to recognize the authenticity of each and every legal tradition. However, Shaykh is a scholar of such vast learning and competence that his origins had already become a classic. The significance of the origins lies in Shaykh's rigorous application of Golzaya's thesis in trying to explain the entire development of Islamic jurisprudence during its formative phase. He then goes on to speak about the response to Orientalists from the Arab world on page 153. So he says, in the Arab countries, 2 pioneering works were Muhammad al-Khudari's Tarikh al-Tashri' al-Islami and Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Hajawi's al-Fikr al-Sami fi Tarikh al-Fiqh al-Islami. By the 40s of the present century of the Christian era, the history of Islamic law had already become a fairly popular subject. Ali Hassan Abdul Qadir, a graduate from Al-Azhar and subsequently a PhD from the University of Berlin, wrote his Nadarat al-Amma Tarikh al-Fiqh al-Islami. On page 154, he speaks about Shibli al-Nu'mani and then Fazlur Rahman. He says, in the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent, the first mentionable work on the subject was Sirah al-Nu'man by Shibli Nu'mani. The book is a biography of Abu Hanifa along with a study of his juristic method. He then speaks about Fazlur Rahman here, of very considerable significance, however, is the work of Fazlur Rahman, Islamic methodology in Rahman in history. Rahman does not deal in detail with the development of Islamic law and jurisprudence, but is centrally concerned with the growth of the Islamic methodology over the entire course of Islamic history. On page 156, he discusses some of the problematic views of Ahmad Amin, and then he has a golden comment on page 168. On page 168, he says something that's really quite interesting. He says, all available evidence corroborates that in Islamic law, that in Islam, law has never been detached from religion, neither in the earliest period nor subsequently. So this is really important. The idea of separating the religious aspect of Islamic law from the religious aspect of Sharia from the law aspect of Sharia. You cannot separate the two. Law is intrinsically attached to Sharia. On page 187, so you can't just be a spiritual person and not follow the actual laws of Sharia themselves. On page 187, he discusses what could be meant by the fitna. He says this is a colossal error. Fitna is a generic term which signifies civil war. It is because of this that Awza'i used this term with reference to a civil war which Awza'i had himself witnessed and which had grave consequences. In any case, he discusses what is meant by the fitna, after which isnad became a staple of hadith transmission. Now the second part of the book, so that was part one. Remember we said the book is divided into 5 parts. The second part of the book starts to go into the early phase, fiqh before Abu Hanifa, and in this section the author speaks about the development of fiqh before Abu Hanifa himself. Now what's really unique about this book is how he speaks about the development of hadith criticism along with the history of ar-ra'i or fiqh as you may call it. So for example, he writes on page 310, again this is just going to be for my copy, 310. He writes on page 310, traditions had as yet not been scrutinized according to the criteria of hadith criticism, for these criteria were as yet not developed. We have seen that isnad had begun to be employed sometime around the middle of the 1st century. Being of recent origin during the 1st century, it was not employed very consistently. The result of all of this was that the generally accepted doctrine of one school or those practices of the community which enjoyed general approval occupied a relatively important position that they did subsequently. And he carries on discussing this even further. Then on page, it's also in this section by the way, that he refers to Ibrahim al-Nakha'i as the first proper scholar of the Ahlul Ra'i, while also touching on the idea of ar-Ra'i itself. So he writes on page 329, and it's a very interesting discussion. So he says, the main achievement of Ibrahim was that he surveyed the entire field of legal doctrines, and in so doing he formulated the tentative framework of Kufian doctrines. Thanks to his interest in the positive doctrines as a whole rather than merely in parts of it, so he looked at Sharia from a bird's eye view, he brought about greater coherence and systematic consistency. This was partly owing to a more frequent use of qiyas on his part, which marks an advance in the direction of the use of ra'i according to a methodological discipline. This development seems to owe itself to some extent to Ibrahim's conscious search for greater coherence and consistency. So this idea of consistency starts with Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, not directly starts with, but like he seems to have had a huge impact on this, and consistency is completely important in fiqh. Underlying this quest, perhaps a subconscious quest for coherence and consistency, there seems to have been some vague notion that the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ were embodiments of principles, qawaid kulliyah. Remember the whole qawaid kulliyah idea from Abu Hanifa? It seems to be starting with Ibrahim al-Nakha'i to some degree, rather than arbitrary fiats. So this is a really important chapter, part 2. Then another important chapter is part 3. So like we said, it's 5 parts. The third chapter, if I can get to it, like I said, mine is a bit disjointed, but the third chapter is all about the semantic evidence. Here the author speaks about the various sources of Sharia, and from pages 115, so he speaks about the Quran, he speaks about Hadith, then he speaks about the Sunnah as well, the Sunnah, and this is a really interesting discussion. Pages 115 to 135, you have one of the best discussions on the Sunnah that you will read, honestly. He speaks about the Orientalist approach towards the Sunnah, and then actually speaks about the difference between the Sunnah and Hadith itself. And so he writes on page 127, just to show you an example of some of the brilliant discoveries that he's made. Not just discoveries, but the way he kind of verbalizes and words some of these important points. He says there is a number of instances which show that Sunnah and Hadith were not used as equivalents in the early period, though they were quite often used as such later by the scholars of the sciences of hadith. Hadith generally referred in the early period to a communication from the authorities narrowed down subsequently with the technical terms were fixed, when the technical terms were fixed, i.e. from the Prophet as well as others, particularly the companions. As for Sunnah, it referred to an established religious norm. Thus, hadith provided the documentation of the Sunnah, but was not Sunnah itself. For every hadith is not necessarily authentic or Sunnah yielding. As against hadith, therefore, Sunnah constitutes an established norm of practical life which has come down most probably from the Prophet and/or from the companions, or in some instances has been inferentially derived from their Sunnah and has been sanctified by consensus. The fourth part is titled Khabar Lazim, and this section speaks all about the role of Imam Shafi'i, and there's this beautiful segment on page 295 of this section, which is section 4. He speaks here, the most important difference between Shafi'i and the ancient schools of law, however, was that for Shafi'i, Sunnah, by which he meant Sunnah of the Prophet alone, was synonymous with well-authenticated traditions from the Prophet, even if these traditions were isolated ones. This almost completely negated the authority of practice. The attitude of Muslim jurists before Shafi'i was markedly different. The Sunnah of the Prophet was not identical with formal traditions. In addition to formal traditions, it had other evidences as well. Traditions were merely reports and constituted one of the evidences of Sunnah, but not its only evidence. They did not exhaust the sum total of authoritative norms which had come down from the Prophet or from the companions, nor was every tradition from the Prophet regarded as acceptable. It is this which explains, at least partly, the rather tantalizing passage of Abu Yusuf wherein he opposes Sunnah to traditions and puts forth the former as one of the criteria for the acceptance or rejection of the latter. There's something really unique in this section, which is section 4, and this is something I want to touch upon. Is something that has troubled me for quite a while, which is to make sense of Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf's usage of hadith. So the author argues around page 300 to about 312 that Imam Abu Yusuf and mainly Imam Muhammad kind of anticipated Imam Shafi'i. So they were kind of somewhere in between the ancient schools and the arrival of Imam Shafi'i, and therefore we notice them inculcating and incorporating more ahadith into their works, at the same time still maintaining some of the ideas of practice, qawaid kulliyah, whilst also speaking about a hadith from a formal perspective, looking at the isnad, looking at the chain of narrations, looking at the ruwat. So Imam Muhammad seems to have kind of anticipated Imam Shafi'i, at least according to this author, by seeing the rise in hadith as a very valid representation of the Sunnah, and thanks to the effort of the muhaddithun, he now wanted to accept a lot of the hadith. He says on page 300, the actual application of these emerging formal criteria was naturally bound, however, to serve more as a tool of criticism of the doctrines of others rather than as a means for a critical scrutiny of one's own doctrines. Gradually, however, it did serve the latter purpose as well, which is evident from the numerous departures of Abu Yusuf and Shaybani from the doctrines of their school on the ground that they were at variance with traditions from the Prophet. It is owing to the coexistence of these two divergent attitudes, the old and the new, the informal and the formal, that the works of fiqh and athar composed during the 2nd century, particularly referring by the way there to Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Shaybani, to be confusing and full of apparent inconsistencies. He's speaking about more how they use hadith and evidences at times, and at times they're using amal, etc. Then on page 306, the author really interestingly dissects the whole e silencio argument of Shaykh, and he gives some decent responses to the whole theory. Then on part 5, which interestingly is like how my book actually looks from the front cover, it's titled Inference, Elaboration and Systemization, wherein the author drives home the point about Imam Muhammad kind of already anticipating a lot of what Imam Shafi'i would come to conclude as his methodology. And he says about Imam Muhammad's restriction, actually the restriction of the use of qiyas, by saying on page 116, in addition to a consistent use of qiyas, Shaybani also explicitly lays down rules with regard to the occasions and the manner in which qiyas may appropriately be used. According to Shaybani, qiyas may be used only in the absence of directly relevant positions in the authoritative sources, athar. In fact, he considers qiyas to be irrelevant even if there is a tradition from some companion on the question concerned. Thus, qiyas may be resorted to only when there is no authoritative rule which is directly relevant to the question concerned in the Quran or in traditions from the Prophet and his companions or in consensus. And this, as for what is the proper method of qiyas, the answer is evident from Shaybani's reference to the alleged instructions of Umar. So you can see Imam Shaybani, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, is already anticipating some of what Imam Shafi'i will come and do. And then the author concludes with a really brilliant comment. This entire book more or less concludes with this idea on page 158. And he says the technical legal legal thought of the Kufians reached its zenith, it's reached its highest point, you could say, in Shaybani, and represented the highest level of technical legal thought achieved by Islamic law up till the time of Imam Shafi. So there's this type of continuation. It wasn't that Imam Shafi ruptured everything and kind of broke away from the ancient schools that existed, the school of Kufa and the school of Hijaz, or Medina, whatever you want to call it. There was a period in between, which I think is represented very well by this author to be that period of Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. Now, of course, all of this makes a lot of sense. I still don't think that Imam Muhammad was heavily engaging in narrating a hadith and completely abandoning a ra'i and abandoning qawaid kulliya completely and amal, etc. As the muhaddithun still, of course, didn't view Imam Muhammad in a very positive way. So clearly he was doing something that they didn't like, which was engagement in ar-ra'i. But it might be better to view Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf as kind of like the bridge between the regional schools and their methodology and the methodology of Imam Shafi, which is kind of what Shaykh Zafar is trying to argue for in this book. Instead of making Imam Muhammad look completely like as though he was fully accepting the muhaddithun approach and making it look like Imam Muhammad was completely with the fuqaha approach, it may be somewhere in between. Now, I would highly recommend that you read this book. Inshallah, you'll really benefit from it. I'll put a PDF for the book in the Telegram channel for Islamic knowledge, which is at IK Courses. You can join using this at IK Courses link. And if you benefited from this video, please do give it a like, share it with someone else who may also benefit. And Jazakumullah khair wa ahsan jaza for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.